Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of the MakdisiStreet podcast. We are delighted to be joined today by Munther Isaac, who's a Palestinian theologian who serves as pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Hope in Ramallah in Palestine. He's also the director of the Bethlehem Institute for Peace and Justice and the director of the highly acclaimed Christ at the Checkpoint conferences. Munther came to global fame after he delivered his famous Christ in the Rubble, December 2023 sermon that noted while the Gaza genocide was unfolding that the world was watching. Here we are in 2025 and the world is still watching as the Gaza genocide continues to unfold. Since that famous sermon, Munther has published a series of interviews and articles and books, the most recent of which is a book by the title Christ in the Rubble, Faith, the Bible, and the Genocide in Gaza, published by Erdemann's Publishers in 2025, which we'll link in the show description below. Munther Isaac, welcome to MakdisiStreet.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Of course.
I guess our first question inevitably is, given the fact that you're in Palestine in this moment of genocide, is how are you as a Palestinian and how are you as a Palestinian Christian?
Yeah, I think right now, if I can describe the mood, is it's anger, it's frustration, and it's also fear. Anger and frustration that this war has not ended. And it seems that everyone seems content with letting the war go on, letting Israel go on with its assault campaign, its vengeance campaign on Gaza. This genocide that is so different than everything we've seen because it's being watched live on earth. It's not as if anybody can claim we did not know. And the fact that this world seems okay to let it go on for this much is so much frustrating. It just gives this impression or makes one feel, are we this cheap to the world in terms of our worth as lives? But at the same time, we're very fearful that this could escalate at any moment to the West Bank. Settler violence is on the rise. It's literally now, it's very dangerous just to live in the villages around, whether it's Ramallah or Hebron, especially Ramallah these days. Attacks on villages are on the rise, and they are telling us what they want to do. It's not as if we have to guess what the plan is. It's not as if, you have to wonder what they're doing. I mean, the plan is clear. They want all Palestinians out, or they want maximum land with very little, with minimum demography, no Palestinians. That's the plan they're telling us. And if they can expel, ethnically cleanse everyone in Gaza, they'll go ahead and do it. If they can go ahead and expel one family at a time, or kill one young man at a time, they'll go and do it as they are doing in the West Bank. And so as we're watching the situation in Gaza, many of us, believe me, we're all thinking and watching and thinking, are we next? And I'm not sure people understand the reality on the ground right now in the West Bank, because every Palestinian area, let's say Ramallah, where we are right now, where I am, I'm not kidding you. All it takes is to close 2 checkpoints, and then we are completely besieged. That's it. Actually, Bethlehem, it's 2. Ramallah now, it's 3. We cannot leave or enter Ramallah. That's it. Ramallah becomes another Gaza. And that's the direction we're heading. Bethlehem, just 2 checkpoints, it becomes another Gaza. Hebron, and it's been like that for years in Qalqilia. And so that's the future. And it's not an exaggeration to use the term massive concentration camps, because this is what it is right now. And if they're kind enough, they'll open the gates as they're doing now in Ramallah at 9 a.m. after the settlers use the road, because apparently they don't want us to use the roads at the same time with the settlers. But it's not apartheid, okay, as they say. And then at 9, and if you're lucky, it's open. If you're not that lucky, you wait 1, 2 hours, 3 hours, or it's closed. You just go back. That's daily life in the West Bank right now. And again, everyone is watching, all the diplomats, everyone knows what's happening, but it seems that the world is content with letting this go on day after day.
So, Munther, I mean, you wrote a book called Christ in the Rubble, which obviously is also the title of your famous sermon in December 2023. As a Christian, and as a Palestinian Christian in particular, I mean, obviously you're a Palestinian first and foremost, but you're also obviously a pastor. What does it mean to have written this, given this sermon, this extraordinarily powerful sermon in 2023 that, as you know, of course, went viral and global? And at the same time, you've published a book, and yet it seems like nobody. I mean, is nobody listening? I mean, how do you as a person of faith, how do you deal with this situation?
Yeah, sometimes in our dark moments, we feel that no one's listening. And to be quite honest, sometimes I wonder, is God listening as a man of faith? Because this war has really impacted everything. I still believe in the God of justice, but it's so strange. And I don't know how to think honestly about that sermon, for example, or everything we've done as Palestinian Christians in the last 2 years, because the sermon did reach unprecedented reach. I'm still, it's hard for me to understand how this happened. The fact that one sermon attracts, gets tens of millions of views, but at the same time, the genocide is still unfolding. And it's not as if on a slower pace. Actually, it's worse now. There is children being starved. It's much worse than when I gave that sermon. Yet, people are listening. And this, wherever I go, I'm continuing to be shocked by the fact that, people are not just listening, but changing and responding their views. Clearly, today, there is a gap between governments or policymakers and what people believe. My concern when I gave that sermon was Christians, to be honest. I mean, would the Christian world worldwide finally realize that Israel is committing a genocide? It's, again, I don't know how to feel, because last month, our sister church in the United States, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, used the G word, genocide, to describe what's happening in Gaza. And we've been crying about that from November, late October of last year. We've seen what's happening. And it's not because we are more insightful that was a genocide, because the Israelis told us they were going to commit a genocide. So now churches are changing their positions. Churches are demanding weapon embargo. People are changing, especially, one of the most maybe important thing to highlight is that people on the right are changing. I mean, the right of the church, the conservative part. And it's not something I can say we need to celebrate, because, it took, maybe 100,000 lives, martyrs, for that to happen. It's very tragic that, this many people have to be killed in such a horrific world for the world to finally realize Israel is not actually this human right champion or democratic state. So honestly, it's a very strange moment, because we don't know what to think. I mean, should we celebrate the change? Should we build on it? I mean, should we, can we really put plans about the future, knowing that the war has not ended and we've done everything we can, honestly, whether it is mobilizing churches, speaking tours, speaking to policymakers, the book, the sermon. But at the end of the day, and this is what we keep saying, we cannot stop. If the war has not ended, that means we need to do more. We need to speak more. We need to write more. We need to do more of this, because we owe it to the people of Gaza to begin with. As I, every time I speak to groups these days, or we do mobilizing, I say, we cannot celebrate anything. We failed the people of Gaza. So let's do more. And honestly, this is how I feel, maybe more than anything right now.
Munther, if I may, and I think we're going to come back to some of these points that you've raised, but I want to, I think from the beginning, I've always, tried to understand from where we are in the Christian church in Lebanon or in Palestine areas, where we're always taught about Jesus, for love, compassion, turn the other cheek, this even resistance fighter, fighting for justice, fighting against oppression, as opposed to this other Jesus or this other God that is often represented, certainly in America, at least among some in America, or some of the big churches in America and other places, where you get this vengeful Jesus, this vengeful God that wants to smite everybody, wants to kill everybody, and there's a kind of vengeance and cruelty and lack of compassion. Is this the same Christianity? Are we talking about the same Jesus, or are these two different religions that we're talking about? Is it because we're rooted in our societies in a kind of multi-confessional society that's open, that we could, this coexistence, people live together and they don't? How do you explain this?
I mean, you're spot on, because many times when we listen to what some of those quote unquote church leaders or pastors or theologians, actually, many of them became congressmen. When we hear they say, we can't but wonder, are they reading the same Jesus? I mean, honestly, Jesus said, love your enemy, turn the other cheek. Whereas those who claim to be his followers say, kill them all. Let's get it over with quickly, using, as we did with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the book, I cite many examples. I could have written a whole book on this, not just a chapter in the book, on how some Christians justified and supported, even called for this genocide. And you're absolutely right. It makes us, honestly, sometimes disgusted that they use the same scripture. They weaponize the Bible, especially since Jesus is the exact opposite of that. But I think, to answer your question, in the Bible, it says, in the beginning, God created, heaven and earth. Then he created us in his image, God created man in his image, humankind. And since then, we've been returning the favor, if you know what I mean. We think, or we offset our own characters or issues on God. And so if we're racist, we make God racist. And maybe we should not be surprised that a country with a settler colonial history, a country that went on and killed millions of indigenous people, thinking that they are superior and entitled, building cities on hills and so on. Should we be surprised that in some circles they create, or they imagine God as a tribal, racist, violent God of war and vengeance? Maybe that's a reflection of this context, the American context and history, a history of triumphalism, a history of always being right, and not just in North America, but even waging wars. For example, the Second Iraqi War, based on a complete lie, and then giving it righteous names because they're always right. They can't be wrong. They are the greatest country on earth, and so on. And as such, that God, the God of that empire, if we wish, serves that empire. And as such, he is a triumphant, violent God who, is for supremacy. So we hear of the Judeo-Christian tradition. We hear of chosenness, entitlement, privilege, greatness. All of these terminologies reflect more and more this belief in American exceptionalism. And if we need a God who serves all of that, then we think of the God of the chosen people who will help us expand our empire. And tragically, they don't see us as equal human beings. We are the Amalekites. And I think maybe that's where we need to look into that history and see that the image of God they reflect is actually a reflection of their own empire, whether it's history or its expansion today. And I feel that we have a message to the world, and especially as Middle Eastern Christians who are the victim of that, who are on the receiving end. It's not as if they're targeting Arabs and Muslims and then respecting Christians or protecting us. On the other note, it's the exact opposite. We are maybe one of the biggest victims of all of this U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Look at the exodus of Christians. But I feel we have a role to continue to challenge that theology and that reflection of God. And to me, that's why I continue saying this is about the credibility of the Christian witness. It's not merely about saving lives in Gaza. It is, for sure. But it's also, to me as a pastor, it's about the credibility about our Christian witness. This is not the Jesus we read about and encounter in the Gospels. For sure, this is not the Gospel of Jesus as we read it.
Munther, if I could just add to Karim's question. I mean, obviously what you're saying is true. We agree with what you're saying. And I guess just to point out that there are, of course, plenty of people across the U.S., across the Western world, in fact, who are viscerally opposed to what the Israelis are doing. So it's not that that's the only understanding of what's happening. I'm sure you don't mean to be saying that, but so there are these other ways of thinking about what's going on. But it's on the other hand, just to confirm what you're saying, at least the part of what you're saying, this sense that there is this sort of, I've always personally pushed back against the idea of right-wing Christians or conservative Christians or Christian Zionists and so forth, because it, as far as I'm concerned, it seems to run so contrary to the teachings of Christ himself. It's like they read certain parts of the Bible very selectively and they skip all the stuff about Christ, all the stuff about mercy and love and forgiveness and compassion and so forth. And I don't know where I was going with that, other than to say that there is a lot of organizing going on at a grassroots level. So perhaps what we're seeing in the church in the West also reflects a broader split in Western culture, Western societies, between popular positions or like a grassroots level and what's going on at an institutional level. So I don't know if you have insight about that tension in Western churches, insofar as you're in contact with Western churches, between a grassroots level and the institutional level or the level of leadership. Do you know about those kinds of conflicts taking place here in the West?
Yes. So there are those, and I'm talking about Christian leaders, pastors, theologians who've been vocal from the very beginning of the war, for sure. And the number and the impact increases, for sure. And I am not undermining any of that. And there are some who sacrificed a lot. There are some who lost positions, whether in universities or in churches. Some were arrested while demonstrating in front of a weapon factory. So we have many friends who are, I don't want to say awakening, but have always been on our side. And I think that constituency is growing. And the divide between church leadership or positions and the people is definitely there. But especially since, many church leaders tend to choose the path of diplomacy, meaning they don't speak up strongly enough or with courage because they don't want to offend anybody. So I don't want to undermine those who are on our side. Many of them are dear friends, and we meet regularly, we organize regularly, we strategize regularly. But I want to push back on something you said, if I may, which is that this kind of notion or support to Israel or theology of empire, as we call it in our circles, is exclusive as if to right-wing or to conservative Christianity. Because if this war has shown us anything, especially in the early stages of it, which shocked us, that many in the very liberal camp, progressive camp, were also silent, even adopting narratives and making statements that are very much in line with the Zionist narrative. And I've actually pushed back and challenged many church leaders, bishops, and those who write statements. And I said, is there any difference between what you said and what the Israeli government would say? Israel has the right to defend itself. Hamas committed barbaric crimes. And this is a just justified war or justified response. And then later they began to say this is not proportionate and so on. And 2 years later, they call it a genocide. Because we kept pushing from the very beginning. You are well educated to know that this is, not just, it's not about self-defense, but how do you say that the occupier is defending itself from the occupied? The colonizer is defending itself. The context was completely missed from the vast majority of church statements and positions, especially those in the progressive liberal camp, which is something that really put us down. We were so angry, we were so frustrated. We've had so many difficult conversations. Things are changing now, slowly, gradually. But again, it's been almost now, it's going to be soon 2 years since this genocide started. So we need to go, in our opinion, especially as now, Palestinian Christians and those on our sides, what we're saying is that the church needs to completely redo the way it dealt with the situation here. And it's not as if, there's a problem with this position or that. It's the whole matrix in which they viewed Israel as, in theological lens, as exceptional with a direct relationship to God or something like that. And then Palestinians through the eyes of human rights. That is what led us here. And just to emphasize on that, we've been, always hitting hard on those on the right. But I look at the American context, many of the so-called very, very liberal commentators, late night shows, even theologians have said nothing. They're still silent. And so we kid ourselves if we only think this is a problem of those on the right, the conservatives on the right, some of whom are now saying it's a genocide and are saying, why are we spending this money on Israel and so on? As I said, it's much deeper and wider than this. And today our message is that everything needs to be redone, done again completely, especially when how churches look at Palestine, the Palestinians. And in theology, we talk about church, Israel, all of these concepts. We need to start afresh.
Yes, Munther, those are really, really important points that you're raising. And I wish you could elaborate a little bit on, for our viewers and listeners, and for us, in fact, when you say that there is in the Western Christian church tradition, there's this privileging of Israel in theological terms, as opposed to the Palestinians, who at best, if they're seen at all, they're seen only in terms of human rights. In other words, there's no theology, there's no history, there's no context, just that they're people who shouldn't be oppressed visibly. How do you explain the concept of the chosen people? Because that's often used, and as you note in your book several times, especially among the so-called Christian Zionists, they often use these phrases from the Old Testament in particular to sort of give Israel a pass theologically and politically, of course.
If you go to any church in the United States right now, be it evangelical or Catholic or Protestant or anything, ask or, study or say the use of the term, for example, Jews return to their land. Jews return to their land. That's pretty much an accepted notion in most Christian circles today. So you don't have to be sophisticated theologically, and I don't want to talk about supersessionism and post-Holocaust theology. And I can bore you with these details. But I just want to show you how strong this narrative is. In most Christian circles today, a phrase like Jews return to their land is very common, very normative. And let's just think for a second of that term, what that phrase is saying. So that it's their land, not ours. And we have been occupying someone else's land. It goes deeper when they talk about history and then theology. History being, when we read the Bible, Jews were there. And theology, God promised the land, and there is a special covenant between God and the Jewish people, and by extension between God and Israel. Many view the establishment of the state of Israel as a divine act. Actually, surveys show that most Christians think of it as either fulfillment of prophecy or an act of God, or in some church documents, a sign of God's faithfulness.
You mean Western Christians, Munther, right?
Western Christians, of course.
Yeah.
And you see what that has done is that this kind of thinking, which came so strong in some circles at the beginning of the 20th century, in the so-called battles within the Western Protestant church between the liberal and the conservative camps, and then in most liberal camps after the Second World War and the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed, that kind of thinking became so prevalent in most Western churches. And as I said, it became very normative. And what it has done is, first, it rendered a Jew living in New York or in Brooklyn as more deserving and gave that Jew a political rights to come and move to Palestine, expel Palestinians, replace them, displace them and replace them, take our land, and it's called a Jew returning to their land. So this is the power of this very deceptive narrative. We need to be very clear. And we undermine sometimes the power of such narratives. So it rendered us as aliens. And then settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing were viewed as divine acts, fulfillment of prophecies. And so no one has dealt with the Nakba through the lens of settler colonialism or as war crimes took place, because everyone has been oriented to think that in churches, this has been a righteous act, an important act, a needed act. And the victims, the Palestinians, part of it is this notion of as if we're less humans. I've always talked about a land without people. It's a Christian phrase before it was a Jewish phrase. They viewed the land as empty, not in terms of people, in terms of people of equal worth. They knew the land had people, but to them, it's Arabs, we can displace them, and we have the means to do that. This is the power of theology that exists in, as I said, conservative and liberal circles alike. In conservative circles, it takes very strong end-time views. This will speed the second coming of Christ. When Jews are in Palestine, they will finally embrace Jesus as their Messiah, not before 2/3 of them will be massacred in a big war, and then they will believe in Jesus, which is actually ironic, given that those Christians who are considered friends of Israel believe that 2/3 of the Jews will be massacred. In fact, some have said it will be worse than the Holocaust. And then the other third will convert to Christianity, and then they are friends of Israel somehow. So there are many of those who are obsessed with the end times on the conservative side, who make Jews subjects in their eschatology, in their framework. This line of thinking actually is anti-Semitic, if we are honest about it. And then there are those who continued and insisted on looking at the Jewish people with special lens. They are special. They are somehow different. They reveal God's design or how God deals with humanity. And that's why in many liberal circles, no matter what Israel does, will say, yeah, Israel is not perfect, but. And at best, with Palestinians, they look at us through the lens of sympathy. We used to think human rights. We were wrong because, all human rights convention were completely dismissed in this war, ignored, even, trust, thrown to the trash, if we're honest about it. And now we wonder, what's our fate in this line of thinking? So what we're saying today is that all of this is wrong. It must stop. It completely, all of these theologies, and we're naming them. The big umbrella is Christian Zionism, but it's so much diverse within that. All of this must change. All of this must end. It has led to a genocide. I mean, we cannot continue to normalize it in church circles. And this will now be our message to the Western church.
Munther, just a clarification on this. I mean, you're talking about the theology and what's being taught in some of these big churches, but you also have this kind of more, what I think are obviously much more cynical statements that also pile on different aspects. So, I mean, I was recently Senator Lindsey Graham says, I'm quoting, "If America pulls the plug on Israel, God will pull the plug on us in the U.S." Ted Cruz, in his kind of infamous interview with Tucker Carlson, says, "As a Christian growing up in Sunday school, I was taught from the Bible that those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed." So this kind of stuff that is used to justify when they cherry pick certain statements in certain parts of the Bible to justify support, even if you're not a Christian Zionist, if you're just a Christian, as Tucker Carlson, they keep referring to Christian with a capital C in this sense of I'm a Christian, separate from Christian Zionists. I mean, I think there is a kind of slight separation between the Christian Zionists and these kinds of Christians per se, who also are looking at all these kinds of statements. Where is the opposition to that? So obviously, in your sermons and sermons of colleagues of yours and others in our regions and in some of the smaller churches, this is happening. But are you saying that we're beginning now to challenge these kinds of statements, to say, no, Lindsey Graham is wrong. What he's quoting is wrong. This is silly. What Ted Cruz is saying is cynical and a total misrepresentation of the Bible. Is Tucker Carlson that place? I know you had an excellent interview with him. Is this a reflection of this change among not necessarily the Christian Zionists, but the Christians as those represented by people like Tucker Carlson and Congresswoman, what's her name, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and people like this?
So what you've pointed is important, because this theology, of course, has found its way to the pews and by extension to politicians who are elected, who are members of these churches. And the Zionists managed to somehow make blessing Israel a tenet of Christianity in the United States. And not loving the neighbor, not charity, not love and compassion. They made, supporting Israel a tenet of faith. And it's shocking to see this line of thinking so common among politicians. But as I said, for the first time now, I think we can talk about a crack in the wall in that camp. Some would say that, Tucker and my interview with Tucker played an important role in that shift. It was kind of, everyone was surprised. I was surprised. And honestly, when I was approached by Tucker's team, I was a bit, shocked. I asked my friends, should I do it? I mean, is this a trap? Is he going to, push back? And I said, even if he pushes back, that's an opportunity. Let's do it. And I came prepared I was actually tense, what kind of questions. And to my surprise, was very respectful and gave me the platform to speak and kept asking, very good questions that many still today reach out to me. And I meet people when I travel, very hardcore conservative church leaders, including Catholics, by the way, who say this was the moment for us to finally realize something is wrong. And by the way, we need to also be, I think, realize that, motives differ. For some who are speaking now against support of Israel, they are very clear this is coming from their America first kind of belief. Why are we spending so much money on Israel? And it's leading us into one war after the other. It's not as if everyone is all of a sudden, we must support Palestinians. But I think they are now realizing that there's a new story and giving voice to us. And I'm grateful that we are invited to speak in churches that are conservative, podcasts, and that there is openness in evangelical circles to the Palestinian Christian narrative, which is our window into presenting the wider Palestinian narrative. And in today's world, in a strange way, Tucker and Candace Owens and even Marjorie Taylor Greene have been so vocal about what's happening. And at the same time, as someone who is so invested in this conversation, maybe too invested, but, we have to, on my social media, I am encountering numerous, and I'm not talking about 5 or 6 or 10 or 15, numerous Christian commentators, pastors, everyone today, opens their phone and makes commentary with tens of thousands of views, sometimes hundreds of thousands of views, who are questioning this narrative, who are commenting on the Ted Cruz interview. So I'm clearly saying that there is a crack in the wall. And to me, this is an opportunity now. We need to have these conversations. We need to reach out to those churches in our neighborhoods. And this is what I've been telling our friends. And because I think, unfortunately, it took 100,000 lives and the total destruction of Gaza. But the least we can do to honor those lives lost is to utilize on the change today and reach out to more people. That's why I said in the beginning, we need to do more. And to me, this is one of the most important reasons why we need to do more, because there is definitely a crack in the wall. And just to say something, I am expecting a strong pushback from the Christian Zionists. Every time, we make an impact, they push back with campaigns, with money, with, pressure, with lobbying. And I'm expecting that. And I know that. When we began doing Christ at the Checkpoint, God knows how much attack we received. When I did the interview, God knows how much I was attacked by the Christian right and by the Israelis, but that we're used to. So I'm expecting a huge pushback. And so that's why I say with this moment, with the crack on the wall, we need to speak more and we need to take advantage of this moment.
So, Munther, when you say there's a crack in the wall, of course, there's more than a crack. I mean, we see this. There's a generation shift. There's global opinion shifting. Of course, as you point out, and as we all know, it took a genocide. Although the trends were building before the genocide, but the sheer sort of inhumanity and depravity of what Israel is doing in Gaza, the starvation of children, the sheer cruelty of everything that's happened. But my question is to go back to that interview with Tucker Carlson that you did. It's true, we were all surprised too. We were surprised that you were on that show. We were surprised that Tucker Carlson would even have a Palestinian on. And I remember you kept speaking as a Palestinian, not just as a Palestinian Christian, but as a Palestinian. And he kept asking you about being Christian, not so much about being a Palestinian. Although maybe he's shifting, I don't know. So my question is there a point in appealing to, or how does one appeal, not so much to Tucker Carlson, but to, let's say, Christian Zionists? Is there a point in addressing those kinds of people who are so fundamentally hostile, as you said, to the very humanity of Palestinians? How does one appeal to Christian Zionists?
Yeah, it's interesting. You're not the first to point out to that because, from our perspective as Palestinian Christians, we never want to make it about us. It's not about just, that churches are attacked and burned. And that is happening. They're burning churches now in the West Bank and spitting on clergy. But more seriously, they froze the tax on, they froze the bank accounts of the Orthodox Church. Now, there is a big dispute about the taxation of church properties again in Jerusalem, which is with fatal results. So we feel actually we're targeted as Christians. But believe me, we never want to make it about us, because we're part of the Palestinian people. Our freedom, our prosperity is directly tied to that of all Palestinians. There is no Christian solution. That's what I keep always, because many well-intentioned Christians, they come, they're surprised, they're overwhelmed, they don't know what to do. So they ask, how can we help the Christian presence? How can we help you? And I always say, you can't just help me. You have to end this thing. But at the same time, maybe, and I think this is important, and maybe that's why Tucker kept shifting the conversation about Palestinian Christians, which is what they've also done with the recent nun he hosted, an American nun who served in Palestine, because he realizes that maybe if people won't listen to a Palestinian, maybe they will listen from a Palestinian Christian. And maybe the next step will be to normalize Palestinian voices, not just Palestinian Christian voices. I'm fully aware that as Christians in the Middle East, as Arab Christians, and particularly as Palestinian Christians, we have a certain bridge, we have a certain platform. As much as I don't like it, the fact that they would listen to a Christian but not to my fellow Palestinian Muslim, I have to take advantage of this. To me, this is added responsibility. It puts more weight on our shoulders. And knowing that many in the West will accept something if it comes from not just a Christian, by the way, a pastor. And that's why, we always say our mere presence as Palestinian Christians poses the biggest challenge on the Zionist narrative. Just if we don't see anything, the fact that we exist, because, we challenge the narrative that this is a religious war and so on. And then we emphasize it's apartheid, it's occupation. So to me, it's added responsibility. And if I'm very vocal, it's because I realize I have a voice, and I realize that more likely people will listen to me as a pastor from Palestine than they would listen to maybe a more articulate and someone who suffered more in Gaza or in Hebron and Khalid than I have. But I have to take advantage of that and speak even more on behalf of all my people. And so that's when I say we have to take advantage of the moment that there is a crack in the wall. This is something we talk about ourselves right now, the Palestinian Christian activists, many of us theologians and activists and pastors who take it upon themselves to speak, to travel, to write. To us, this is an opportunity that cannot be missed, knowing again that there will be a pushback, whether from the media, from the Christian Zionist lobby, and from the Israeli lobby, there will be a pushback. So we need to take advantage of this moment.
Munther, I think I totally agree. And I think, in fact, that it's an absolutely essential role that you and your colleagues play, both, as Christians, but also as pastors and others, because, the US and the politicians and the discourse it's a very religious country. It's, they're always talking about religion, about the Christianity, etc. And, it's always the case that as Christians in the Arab East, there's we play a disruptive role, because they want to, the discourse of it's Christians versus Muslim, it's Jews against Muslims, etc., is totally disrupted when you get a Christian, and especially a Christian pastor, saying, no, the Israelis are attacking us. This is not religious. They're attacking us. They're destroying us. We are with our fellow Muslims or other, Palestinians or Arabs that are in the region. So I think it's an incredibly important role, as you're saying, and one that you've been fulfilling extremely eloquently. The question that just kind of connected to the previous one I asked, when we're trying to say there is this, I think, improvement, there's the narrative disruption. People like Tucker Carlson and others are giving you and others platforms to talk about it. They've realized finally that not just that there's Christian humanity, but there's Palestinian humanity. I think it's slowly kind of seeping in there. But for example, recently Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, canceled the visa because some Zionists, found out that there's, children that have come in, a handful of them that have come in to the United States for special treatment on a temporary visas, and Marco Rubio finds out about it and cancels them and says nobody can come in, even kids that can only come to America for kind of medical treatment. Even these are not allowed in anymore. Does that serve as a place to mobilize, to say, to attack, but to create a different sense of what Christianity would interpret in that kind of thing towards children that are being denied medical treatment? Is this a kind of a window where Christian activists and others can exploit from the religious kind of point of view?
It's not just, by the way, for Christians. I think right now one of the beautiful things that's happening, if we may use this word in such a dark moment, is the fact that there are many interfaith alliances that are being created. I had the opportunity to travel to the United States this year and last year, and I met with Christians, Jews, and Muslims really working hard together to say this cannot be our faith, this cannot be religion. And right now, it's really shocking to me that the Zionist camp, let's put it this way, is committing horrific crimes unapologetically, whether it's the starvation in Gaza or such decisions to revoke the visas, or even, the attacks on students for demonstrating, or those who sympathize with, which hits at what Americans have been boasting about for the entire world for years about freedom of speech and so on. But when it's about criticizing Israel, it's no longer freedom of speech, or even calling for justice for Palestinians. And so with crimes and with violations and assaults on humanity this severe, this outrageous, if people of faith don't speak, then I don't know who will. And as I said, they are speaking. People of faith are speaking. Coalitions are being created. I have friends who are creating coalitions, one congregation at a time. Now they've reached thousands of churches and synagogues calling for as the end of apartheid. So emphasizing that, and they began before the war. Now they are even stronger. So if we are not going to speak now, and if it's not us, then who? And this is a very, very critical moment in our history because, and I'm talking about our collective humanity. It's not about Gaza just. It's much more than that. I hope people realize that it's much more than Gaza. It's Palestinians and those who support them first. But then we need to ask who's next. And these are strange times because those who speak for humanity, like Francisca Albanese, is being targeted, or the South Africans, or those the judges in the ICJ, while a war criminal like Netanyahu still travels freely. If people of faith don't speak, then we are accepting and allowing a world in which might is always right and the tyrant can have their way, expand, take land, kill people, displace people. They can give it names, but they can justify it no matter what they want. And if we are okay with that, then we're all at danger. We're heading into chaos. And we've been saying, by the way, that we never believed that the international law was perfect or the human rights conventions were perfect. We've always sensed there was imbalance of power, there was too much white control, and so on. But at least they served as a gauge or as a measure or as protection. Now they're no longer serving as that. Are we okay with that? Are we okay in a world in which children can be starved? And so if people don't speak up, and this is our message, if you're not willing to speak up now, not just people will die, children will be killed, but it's about the credibility of our witnesses, people of faith, and history will record that we were silent. And I hope, it doesn't just become another anecdote in history in which they say, well, and people of faith were silent. And, the church was silent. So this is the moment to speak. And this is the moment to demand action. And by that, I mean, it's not just about speaking that the genocide must stop. I've been saying that, war criminals must be held accountable. There needs to be sanctions. There needs to be, we cannot normalize a genocide. To many, this is controversial. To me, this is an ethical choice. I cannot, we cannot normalize the relationship with a state that committed genocide. So this is an ethical faith position. And today, more and more people of faith are coming together from the grassroots, demanding that there needs to be a change in positions and in action.
So, Munther, if I can just ask you on that very point on interfaith, because here in the US, oftentimes they talk about interfaith as a way of avoiding talking about Palestine, talking about the genocide in the terms that you and I, all of us, are describing and talking about. They do it as a way to avoid, and yet you're talking about a very different kind of solidarity, a solidarity based and rooted in actual witness of actual oppression and to end that oppression, right? So can you just clarify that there's a difference between, when you talk about interfaith, you're talking about interfaith based on actual solidarity and ethical positions, not on avoiding talking about real issues, correct?
I'm talking about alliances for justice, alliances for freedom, interfaith alliances. Reverend Munther Isaac, a Palestinian theologian, famously coined the phrase that theology has been the software of empire. And he's very right in that. But he actually said this in the beginning about Christian-Jewish dialogue. Because in most liberal circles, Christian-Jewish dialogue was a way of precisely that, not talking about Palestine. Even more, endorsing and supporting Zionism in its different ways, emphasizing this exceptionalism kind of, and having conversations about the nature of that. So for years, Christian-Jewish dialogue has been what Jewish theologian, liberation theologian Mark Ellis has described as the ecumenical deal, in which, Jews will accept to meet with Christians and forgive them, or, allow them to make amends for years of anti-Semitism or persecution. And in exchange, Christians have to accept Zionism and not talk about what's happening in Palestine. Today, I think we're also witnessing the when it comes to Judaism, for example, the rise of many Jewish scholars and theologians and activists who are clearly and openly anti-Zionist. This is not the Zionist left. This is not the Israeli left. We're talking about anti-Zionist Jews all over the world, especially in the United States, also in Europe. They've held a convention in Austria recently. Hundreds were in attendance. They could have had more, I heard. And so there is a shift, definitely. And what we're saying today is maybe we need to completely rewrite and redefine interfaith dialogue. And make sure it's not just about the elite, and make sure it's coined with action that is oriented towards justice. And by the way, this is not new. The civil rights movement did this, right? It wasn't just, as if secular or Christians alone, everyone joined together. And when we say interfaith, we also want people of nay faith. It's not just confined to Christian Jews or Muslims or Buddhists or Hindu, everyone who believes in humanity and equality for all, and who thinks just genocide is wrong. Genocide is evil and cannot be tolerated. We need to create more and more of these grassroots movements of change that will make a difference in the world. It's a marathon. It's not as if we can create this tomorrow. But given Gaza, things must be different. Today, post-Gaza, it's not even post-Gaza. As a result of Gaza, everything must be different.
Munther, I wanted to come back and move away from talking about the West and America and come back to the Arab East. I'm in Lebanon here, and I want to ask you, what is the solidarity, what is the solidarity first among the different sects and so the Orthodox, the Protestants, the Catholics, etc., within Palestine, and the Armenian Church, etc. All these, is there a way in which they all coordinate and spread messages and show solidarity? That's on the one hand. On the other hand, what about the churches in Lebanon, for example, or Syria? And of course, each has its own political context and constraints and issues like that. But is there, and even Iraq, is there a sense that in the Arab East, the churches are also aligning messages, are trying to amplify, are speaking out, are doing what they can, humanitarian-wise, religious doctrine-wise, I don't know, politically, in the ways that they can? Is there this? Or are we just focusing on the West? And because, of course, that's the major place. But in the Arab East, is we don't hear about it. We never read about it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, within Palestine, we are working together on the different levels. There is first the level of the heads of churches, the patriarchs and bishops in Jerusalem. They coordinate their statements most of the times. Their positions, they consult one another, especially since this is an assault against all of us, whether in Gaza or in Jerusalem or in the villages in the West Bank. And in fact, when you go back in our recent history, the first time, Palestinian heads of churches came up with a joint statement together was in response to the Intifada, the first Intifada. So heads of churches are speaking, knowing that they're under tremendous pressure, especially from Israel. But they have made very strong statements, especially when churches were attacked, but even beyond that, when hospitals were attacked. And they have made many efforts to push for a ceasefire, and that certainly prayers are important, but beyond that, lobbying and so on. They're also coordinating the work in Gaza to support first the Christian community that is besieged in the two churches, and make sure they are not displaced, make sure they are provided for. But of course, they were killed in the church, in the beginning and just recently. Many were killed because of lack of medicine and so on. But the heads of churches are working together, and Christian organizations to provide, and also for the Al-Ahli Hospital, which is run by one of the churches in Jerusalem, the Anglican Church. And on the grassroots levels, we are also working together. From the very beginning, actually, I think 3 weeks or so into the genocide, 12 Palestinian Christian organizations from the grassroots made a very strong call to the Western world. We called it a call for repentance, a message from Palestinian Christians to the global church, which attracted a lot of attention and signatures and discussions and webinars, because we said back then, 3 weeks into the war, what's happening now? And no one believed us. Very few did. And in Kairos, Palestine, and in other movement, we are coordinating. We work from different church traditions. Grassroots movements, most of the time, they're not, and Palestinian organizations, are not denominational in their, we just work together for everyone, with everyone. The church in the Arab world, to be honest, many times you get the impression it's so much in line with the official position of the state. But there has been some very strong statements from the neighboring countries, from the churches, and very strong calls. And in some instance, we've held, we've made letters and calls. I know because I do work a lot with Protestants and evangelicals, but mainly evangelicals many times. We made a call from evangelical leaders in Egypt and Lebanon, in Syria and Iraq, and we sent it to many evangelical pastors. So we're trying to organize some of these efforts and to show that this is beyond just Palestine, and that many Christian leaders, and definitely the Middle East Council of Churches has been very vocal from the beginning. They also are disturbed by these views that we see in the Western world. And maybe, they need to be more, it's not just about being vocal. Many times it's about communication. But they are certainly in line with our position. But most of the focus usually is on what Palestinian Christians are saying. Maybe we need to do a better job in bringing all these voices together, especially now in the aftermath. It's not over yet, but in line with what's happening in Gaza.
Munther, just one last question, because I know we have to close now. Just at least one last question from me, which is to go back, because we've been talking about Gaza. Can you just, for me and perhaps for others in the audience, can you talk to us a little bit about, where Christianity came to Gaza? Why, people simply didn't know that there were churches, very old churches, a kind of ancient community there. Can you just a little bit tell us about that? I think there was, if I remember correctly, there was a population of around 3,000. At least there used to be a population around 3,000 Christians or so in Gaza, and they were from Gaza, so they were not refugees like the majority of the Gaza population itself. Can you talk about and what the main churches are and what their status? Have they all been destroyed? Are they still standing?
Yeah, I talk about this in my book, and we need to go back much beyond that, to the early centuries, because Gaza became in the second and in the third and the fourth century an attraction for monks and for monasteries. And even today, there are remains of many of these churches and monasteries all across the Gaza Strip. And it was St. Porphyrius who brought, structured Christianity, not Christian, structured Christianity into Gaza when the church was built, I think in the 5th century. And since then, there has been a Christian presence. There were times when it was a very strong Christian presence. There were times when it was even a sending hub, kind of missionary hub to the east. And like all in Palestine, the Christian presence was impacted by the different developments around. Certainly, it took a hit during the Crusades, but it never ceased to exist. So there has always been a continuous Christian presence in Gaza since the 5th century. There were some Christian refugees from the Nakba in 1948 in Gaza, but the majority of the Christian population are indigenous to that area. And they've been there for generations upon generations. After the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, in one of the first census, it was 3,000 Christians in the Gaza Strip. But that number kept declining, especially after the siege and after Hamas took over. Those Christians who felt we have an opportunity to leave, whether through Egypt or through the West Bank during the Christian holidays when they are allowed to visit the churches in Bethlehem, and then they would not return and just be there, quote unquote, illegally by Israel's apartheid laws. You're in Gaza, you stay in Gaza. So they would take advantage of that and stay there. So the number kept declining.
Sorry, you mean fleeing because of Hamas or because of the occupation and the siege?
To be honest, both, especially in the very beginning of Hamas's reign, when there was so much chaos. And Hamas definitely in the beginning did put some restraints on Christians. Those restraints eased up a lot, especially in the last years, just before 2023, October 7th. But of course, the biggest thing is the siege. How can you live in such a big and open air prison? I talked to the friends, our friends who are in Gaza who came to Bethlehem or to Ramallah. They wish they could return. But again, this is the kind of dilemma you are in. You either live in Bethlehem or in Gaza. You live in Ramallah or in Gaza. So the ultimate problem is the siege. It's the political reality. And, until, 2023, there was around 1,000 Palestinian Christians left in Gaza or so. Right now, we think there's around 600 or so Christians left in Gaza. Many were killed directly. Many were killed indirectly, but they are victims of the genocide. Many had no access to hospitals, to medicine, especially elderly people who were sick. So some were able to escape in the beginning of the war, when you were still able to pay the ridiculous amount of money on the borders and allowed to escape. So right now there is around 600 or less, a little bit less maybe, Palestinian Christians left in Gaza. The vast majority of whom, and the number is small, so we are, you can easily get a sense of how things are. The vast majority of whom their property, their homes are destroyed. Maybe one or two families were lucky enough not to have their homes destroyed. So if they survive, we pray, we hope they survive this genocide. The question remains, like the 2 million Palestinians, where will they live? And so will there be a future for Christians in Gaza? That's a serious question. Will they choose to stay? Or will they, after so much trauma, would you blame anybody for just wanting to escape that kind of environment and get as far away as they want from this horrible nightmare they are living in? So we don't know if there will be a future for Christians in Gaza. And despite that, some are so stubborn, they continue to say this is the Palestinian Sumud. We will not leave. Some even from within the churches. Some have relatives here, and their relatives say, shall we get you a visa to this country? And then they say, we will never leave. That's the resilience of many, many, if not most, Palestinians.
Munther, thank you so much, Munther, for your, honestly, for all your work, for your witness, for your time with us, and for all that you're doing for Palestinians and for, honestly, for humanity. Because in the sense, as you've said all along, and in your book and your sermons, with us today, those who speak out on behalf of the Palestinians are, of course, speaking out on behalf of all of humanity, because we are at this crossroads now. So thank you so much, and we wish you, of course, all justice and liberation soon,
and safety.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Definitely.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, take it off you.
All right, guys. I think that was an incredible interview with an incredible person, Munther Isaac, who used to be in Bethlehem, has now moved to Ramallah. As he said, Sadi, what did you make of that interview?
I mean, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary because of what he represents, because of the position he occupies, and because of this. I mean, the conversation hinged a lot on this strange role of Palestinian Christians, because Palestinian Christians have been rendered invisible in the normative discussion in the West, especially in the U.S., which is, like so many things in the U.S., structured around binary terms of Jews versus Muslims, and Christians Palestinian Christians completely disappear, even though, as you know, Palestinian Christians have held a disproportionate amount of influence or degree of influence in Palestinian politics and culture and so forth. So I think it's interesting. I also think we've talked about this on this podcast many times, in the past as well. That there are major cracks opening up. There's a lot of dissent about Zionism and Israeli policies, and obviously, starting with the genocide, but it actually precedes the genocide. The genocide kind of has brought things to a head, that are obviously heavily on the left. I mean, not the official left, the popular left, but also now beginning to take off on the right too. And from the right, they're coming at it from some sort of Christian perspective. Tucker Carlson is who came up in the conversation is a case in point, right? So from Tucker Carlson's position, it's like, why did I not know there were Palestinian Christians? That's exactly, why did you not know? But now that he knows, it's like it's beginning to open up new avenues of dissent, which I think is I think it's very important. I think as Palestinians, we need to use every avenue possible to reach as many audiences as possible to make the point about this confrontation and struggle against not just a genocidal regime, but that's the worst thing, of course, but a long-standing apartheid regime as well, and in pre-48, in 67, in the West Bank, in Haifa and Jaffa, as much as in Gaza and everywhere else. And that's what the struggle is about. And religion is almost entirely irrelevant. This is a racial conflict, a settler colonial conflict, primarily about land and rights, and that's what this fundamentally comes down to. So his perspective is incredibly valuable in that respect. I have some more things to say, but Karim, what did you think?
No, I totally agree. I think it was extremely important to hear his voice. I thought his early on in our discussion, he says he was asking if God was listening. He was wondering. I mean, this is a priest who's saying this and asking this question, pastor, and if he's asking this question, I mean, you can imagine the rest of us who are not pastors, how we're thinking about in reference to Gaza, in reference to what's going on in so many places, but obviously the genocide in Gaza primarily, but now, as he mentioned several times, this spread to the West Bank and to other areas that's happening and will inevitably happen at a faster rate. So I thought this questioning is extremely important for us to kind of think about. The other thing, that I asked him, and he I think responded at length, which is this question of Jesus and what he represented. And we had Munther Isaac before in a previous podcast, that maybe we can reference him in the
December 2023.
December 2023. We can maybe put the reference somewhere. We talked, if I recall, Sama, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was talking as well. That was about Christmas, and he was talking about Jesus as basically as a Palestinian resistance fighter, in a sense that he would have been in that context, and in this context of Munther Isaac's book, where he what was the title again, Osama? The title of the book and his
Christ in the
famous
Rubble.
Christ in the Rubble. So these kinds of references of Christ as resistance, Christ as well as love and compassion and justice and fighting for the oppressed and fighting for the poor, all these kinds of references in juxtaposition to these horrible people like Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham and the Christian Zionists and those huge churches in Texas and other places where they're just spewing poison, and the kind of Christianity that we knew nothing about growing up. As I mean, certainly me, I just this idea of
None of us did.
Christianity. Yeah, I mean, of course, crusades and all that. We obviously we know this. I mean, I'm not being totally ahistorical about this. It's not that Christians were lily white in history, of course not. But in our contemporary kind of period, this idea of referring to Christianity and Jesus as nothing but vengeance and war and misery and genocide, and yes, it's okay, and all of this, in juxtaposition to what people like Munther Isaac and others in our part of the world, not all of them, but at least these kinds of people are referring to. So you have this battle, this discursive battle, the battle of narratives, that is extremely important, I think, in this time, and I think will make further inroads as so-called Christians in America wake up. Not just the progressives, but the kind of conservative churches and others are waking up to the fate of Christians in Palestine and in Lebanon, perhaps, and in Syria. And at the same time, I think this will, even if the concern is Christians, I think it'll increase and go to Palestinians in general. That's how I see this going. What do you think, Osama?
I of course I agree with you, Karim. I think it's also, I think part of what he says in the book, and he also mentioned it in brief in the discussion with us, is the idea that he says it's not just the evangelical Christian, so-called Christian Zionists who are the problem. Of course, they are a huge problem because of the way they misinterpret and the way they read literally passages from the Bible without actually understanding the meaning of Christ, and so on and so forth. But his point was, it's Joe Biden, it's all the liberal theologians, it's all the liberal churches that have for decades and decades and decades accepted Israel and accepted the idea of the place of Israel theologically after the Holocaust in particular, and have ignored the Palestinians except as, if anything, except as pathetic people who need to be clothed and taken care of at a very basic, rudimentary human level, but nothing spiritual, nothing ethical, nothing theological. I think that point is really important. It's not just the so-called Christian Zionists on the right who have been the problem. It's also the liberal the liberal churches, and of course we see this in academia. I mean, liberal academics who have been at the forefront of denial of racism, of incredible indifference to Palestinian history and humanity. And we see this sort of playing out before our time. So I think that was really important, to not just focus on the Christian Zionists, as awful as they are, collectively, in terms of their anti-Palestinian sort of positions. So I think it was really important. I think, Karim, the question you raised at the end about the Arab churches was interesting, and about the fact that so many that the solidarity seems to be overwhelmingly a solidarity with Western Christian churches, and yet the Arab churches just seem to be almost, I don't know, was this the question you were asking,
Not
or
all.
was this where you were
Not
coming
all.
from?
But
No,
to be fair,
certainly not all.
I
And
mean, he was
certainly
pointing out
no,
that there was solidarity,
good
and
point.
there is the
Yes.
context of state policy and what they can and can't do. But yes, I do think just being in
Yeah,
Lebanon, for
Osama,
example,
I think that's
it's
important,
muted.
Osama, actually, because part of
Yeah,
what
no, I'm
happens
with-
is part of what
Go ahead.
happens though is that like any other form of solidarity between Palestinians and neighboring or Arabs in general, Arabs and other Arab states, it runs into this thing about there are obstacles there, right? So Palestinians have always been cut off in that sense from the Arab hinterland. I mean, Palestinians inside Palestine.
Except for the fact that he did mention correctly that the Middle East Council of Churches has taken has made important statements, right? So it's not just, I think, in other words, the point I was trying to make, maybe I wasn't clear, is that when we think of solidarity, we should also think of the Arab Christians and also all the Arabs in general. I mean, that form of solidarity is also important, and not just solidarity with Western Christian, churches. I think that was what I understood Karim's question to be. I think it's an important avenue for us to think about and discuss in the future, thinking about the Arab, Middle Eastern, global South connections, not just the global North.
Yeah, I think it's very important. Sari, I know you've done it. Obviously, your bulk of your work has been on William Blake, and I know off camera we were talking about how the connection between William Blake and Christianity, and of course I don't know anything about this, so maybe we can close with your talking to us about your work and about William Blake.
No, I'm not going to give you a lecture on Blake, but I mean, I kept thinking through this entire conversation from the very beginning about Blake, because he represented in the late 18th, early 19th centuries in England the standpoint of, I mean, in other words, if Munther's point is empire theology, which is powerful, right? And so the validation of imperial power by establishment churches, that's obviously not a new thing. In Blake's day, Blake was somebody who was profoundly a Christian, but from a very different kind of resistant, point of view. And his position was essentially that we have to push back against empire theology. He called it universal.
This is the late 18th century.
Yeah, the very end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century. And Blake was a poet and a printmaker and an artist. He produced all his own work, but he was a very profound Christian thinker. But the point is, he didn't go to a normal church. He didn't belong. He was baptized in the Church of England, but he didn't go to Church of England services. He belonged to a radical strand of Protestantism, similar to the one that Milton was involved in a century before him, that believed in pushing back against the judging and punishing God, primarily in their figuration, the Old Testament God of punishment and judgment, and the commanding God too, the one of the 10 Commandments,
vengeance,
thou shalt not, that kind of God. And for people like Blake, the figure of Christ is the antithesis of the punishing, judging God, right? So Christ for Blake is a rule breaker. He broke all the 10 Commandments, first of all. He spoke with outcasts, and that's where he's always moving. And so for Blake, Christ is a transgressor. He's a lawbreaker. He brings freedom. He challenges authority. He pushes back against scriptural authority and the power of the book, and all these kinds of things, right? So, but in the context of the genocide in Gaza, there's a passage in Blake's annotations on Richard Watson, who was a profoundly conservative theologian in the late 18th century, and Watson has a kind of an attack on Tom Paine, who's most best known for his pamphlet, called Rights of Man, and in it, Watson is making the point that we have to do what the Bible says, we have to follow the commandments of the Bible, and so on and so forth. And Blake brings up a passage in particular about the Canaanites in Watson's pamphlet. And Blake says, and I'm quoting Blake here, I have it in front of me, to me, he says, this is Blake, to me who believe the Bible and profess myself a Christian, a defense of the wickedness of the Israelites in murdering so many thousands upon pretense of a command from God is altogether abominable and blasphemous. And so, of course, here he's talking about the massacre of the Canaanites by the Israelites. The Canaanites and all the other people who used to live in Palestine before the Israelites got there. The Canaanites and the Jebusites and the Moabites and obviously the Philistines and all these people who were there before. And he's like, his position is massacring people because you think you represent God's commandments is evil. Let's call it what it is. And it's amazing that he's writing, of course, 200 plus years ago, but his words ring true from this radical, transgressive Christian point of view today, as much as they did in the 1790s or early 19th century when he wrote those words. So it's always worth thinking about, I think.
Yeah, I think this battle within Christianity is very important to track, especially its connections to what's going on in Palestine today.
Yeah.
Okay, guys. It was great to see you all.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.